The gunshot echoed through the valley like a clap of thunder, startling a flock of birds from the cottonwood trees along the creek. Rose Lawson clutched her father's bloodied hand as tears streamed down her dust-covered face. The year was 1877, and the unforgiving Colorado Territory had just claimed another soul. "Papa, please don't go," she whispered, her voice breaking as her father's grip weakened. At 21, she had already endured more hardship than most women twice her age, but nothing could have prepared her for this moment. Thomas Lawson's eyes fluttered open one last time. "Promise me, Rosie," he rasped, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "Promise you'll marry Elias Hargrove. He'll take care of the ranch, take care of you." Rose shook her head violently. "No, Papa, I can't. You know how I feel about him." "You must." His voice grew urgent. "The debt, the ranch, it's the only way." With one final rattling breath, Thomas Lawson was gone, leaving Rose alone in the dirt outside their modest homestead near Cripple Creek. For a moment, she sat frozen, the weight of her father's final request crushing her chest. Elias Hargrove was the most prosperous rancher in Teller County, but he was also cruel, arrogant, and 20 years her senior. The thought of being his wife made her stomach turn. "Miss Lawson?" A deep voice broke through her grief. Rose looked up through tear-blurred eyes to see Sheriff Peyton approaching cautiously, his hat in his hands. "I'm mighty sorry about your pa," he said. "Do you have any idea who might have done this?" Rose wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "No, but whoever it was, they shot him in the back, like a coward." She looked down at her father's still form. "He was unarmed, just riding back from town." Sheriff Peyton nodded grimly. "I'll start asking around. We'll find who did this, Miss Lawson. That's a promise." But Rose barely heard him. Her mind was reeling with her father's dying request and the impossible situation she now found herself in. The ranch was struggling, mortgaged to the hilt, and without her father's steady hand, she knew it would fail. Elias Hargrove had been circling like a vulture for years, offering to buy them out, and when that failed, offering his hand in marriage. The next few days passed in a blur of grief and forced practicalities. The funeral was a small affair, attended by the handful of neighbors who lived within riding distance. Rose stood dry-eyed by the grave, having shed all the tears she could in private. "Miss Lawson." Elias Hargrove materialized at her side like an unwelcome shadow. "My deepest condolences." "Thank you, Mr. Hargrove," she replied stiffly, keeping her eyes fixed on her father's freshly dug grave. "I understand your father spoke to you about our arrangement," he continued, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I hope you've had time to consider the wisdom of his final wishes." Rose turned to face him. At 41, Elias Hargrove cut an imposing figure. Tall and broad-shouldered with a thick mustache and cold blue eyes, he was considered handsome by many in the county. But Rose had seen the calculating cruelty behind those eyes, the way he treated his workers, and the ruthless methods he employed to expand his holdings. "My father's body is barely cold, Mr. Hargrove. This is hardly the time or place." Hargrove's mouth tightened beneath his mustache. "Of course, forgive my insensitivity. But do remember, Miss Lawson, that the bank will be calling in your father's loans within the month. Without a husband or means to pay—" He left the sentence hanging, but the implication was clear. Rose felt a chill run down her spine, despite the warm May sunshine. "Good day, Mr. Hargrove," she said, turning away from him. As the mourners dispersed, Rose found herself approached by Mrs. Sullivan, the midwife who had helped bring her into the world 21 years ago. "You're welcome to stay with me, child," the elderly woman offered, her weathered face creased with concern. "You shouldn't be alone at the ranch." Rose shook her head. "Thank you, Mrs. Sullivan, but I need to be there. I need to figure out what to do next." The ride back to the Lawson homestead was lonely. The empty saddle of her father's horse a constant reminder of her loss. When she arrived, she was surprised to see a stranger leaning against the corral fence, watching the few horses they owned with an appraising eye. He straightened as she approached, removing his hat to reveal tousled dark hair. "Miss Lawson?" he asked. Rose reined in her mare, regarding him warily. "Yes? Who might you be?" "The name's Vaughn Blackwell. I was a friend of your father's from his mining days. I just heard about what happened." His voice was deep, with a slight drawl that suggested he'd spent time in Texas. "I came to pay my respects and to see if there was anything I could do." Rose studied him. He was tall and lean, with sun-bronzed skin and striking green eyes that seemed to see right through her. His clothes were those of a working cowboy, faded denim, scuffed boots, and a worn leather vest over a simple cotton shirt. A gun belt hung low on his hips, the holster well worn but cared for. "My father never mentioned you," she said cautiously. A faint smile crossed his face. "No, I don't imagine he would have. We had a complicated history. But we crossed paths again in Denver last month, and we buried our differences. He wrote to me about the trouble with the ranch." Rose frowned. "What trouble?" "The mortgage, the threats, Elias Hargrove." Vaughn Blackwell's expression hardened at the mention of the rancher's name. "How do you know about that?" Rose demanded. "Your father told me. He was worried, Miss Lawson. Worried enough that he asked me to come help if things went bad." He glanced around the property. "And from what I can see, things have gone about as bad as they can get." Rose dismounted, her legs shaky after the long day. "I don't need your help, Mr. Blackwell. I don't even know you." "Fair enough," he conceded, placing his hat back on his head. "But you should know that Hargrove is dangerous, more dangerous than you might realize." "Are you implying that he had something to do with my father's death?" Rose asked, her heart racing. Vaughn's eyes met hers, steady and serious. "I'm not implying anything. I'm just saying, be careful. And if you change your mind about needing help, I'll be staying in town at the Cripple Creek Hotel." With that, he tipped his hat, mounted his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion, and rode away, leaving Rose with more questions than answers. The following weeks were a struggle of sleepless nights and endless work. Rose threw herself into ranch chores, trying to keep the small operation afloat by herself. She had to let go of their 2 hired hands. She simply couldn't afford to pay them, and she sold off half their cattle at a loss just to generate enough cash to keep the wolves from the door for another month. But the banker, Mr. Peterson, was growing impatient. "Miss Lawson," he said during her latest visit to his office, "I understand your situation is difficult, but business is business. The bank needs its money." "I just need more time," Rose pleaded. "The fall cattle prices will be better, if I can just hold on until then." "I'm afraid that's not possible," Peterson interrupted, adjusting his spectacles. "However, Mr. Hargrove has made a generous offer to assume your debt in exchange for your hand in marriage. It would solve all your problems." Rose stared at him in disbelief. "All my problems except for being trapped in a loveless marriage to a man twice my age." Peterson had the grace to look uncomfortable. "These are practical matters, Miss Lawson. Women in your position can't afford the luxury of romantic notions." "Is that all, Mr. Peterson?" Rose asked coldly. "You have until the end of the month, Miss Lawson. Then I'm afraid we'll have to foreclose." Rose left the bank with her head held high, but once outside, she leaned against the wall of the building, fighting back tears of frustration. She had less than 2 weeks to find a miracle. "Rough day?" came a familiar voice. Rose looked up to see Vaughn Blackwell watching her with those penetrating green eyes. She quickly straightened, embarrassed to be caught in a moment of weakness. "Nothing I can't handle," she replied stiffly. "Of course," he agreed, but the knowing look in his eyes suggested he didn't believe her. "I was just heading to the saloon for a meal. Would you care to join me? As a friend of your father's, I'd like to share some stories about him that you might not have heard." Rose hesitated. The proper thing would be to refuse. An unmarried woman had no business entering a saloon, and she barely knew this man. But the mention of stories about her father was tempting, and she was desperately tired of being alone with her worries. "Just for a meal," she agreed cautiously. The saloon was relatively quiet in the late afternoon. Vaughn led her to a corner table, well away from the bar where a few miners were already starting their evening's drinking. He ordered them both steak dinners and coffee. "So," Rose said once their food arrived, "how did you know my father?" Vaughn cut into his steak before answering. "We met during the gold rush in '59. I was just a kid, barely 18, working a claim with my older brother. Your father had the neighboring claim." That would have been before he met my mother, Rose realized, calculating the dates. Yes, he was a different man back then, ambitious, driven. We all had big dreams of striking it rich. A shadow crossed Vaughn's face. "My brother died in a cave-in. Your father pulled me out of the same collapse, saved my life." "He never told me any of this," Rose said softly. "After the accident, I sold our claim and moved on. Tried my hand at different things, cattle driving, buffalo hunting, even rode with the Pony Express for a spell before the war." He took a sip of his coffee. "Lost track of your father until I ran into him in Denver last month." "And he told you about our troubles with Hargrove?" Vaughn nodded. He was worried. Said Hargrove had been pressuring him to sell, and when that didn't work, started suggesting a marriage between you and him would solve everyone's problems. "And now my father's dead," Rose said bitterly, "shot in the back on the road from town, the day after he refused Hargrove's latest offer." "You think Hargrove was behind it?" "I can't prove it," Rose admitted. "But who else would benefit from my father's death? Now I'm alone, desperate, and being pushed into the very marriage my father was resisting." Vaughn's expression darkened. "Hargrove's always been ruthless in business, but murder is a different matter." "You know him?" "Our paths have crossed," Vaughn said cryptically. "Let's just say we're not on friendly terms." They finished their meal, and Vaughn insisted on escorting Rose back to the livery where she'd left her horse. "Thank you for the meal, Mr. Blackwell," Rose said as they walked, "and for the stories about my father." "Vaughn," he corrected, "and it was my pleasure." As they reached the livery, Rose turned to face him. "Why are you really in Cripple Creek? It seems like too much of a coincidence that you'd arrive right when I need help the most." Vaughn's expression grew serious. "Your father wrote to me after their last confrontation. He was afraid of what Hargrove might do and asked me to keep an eye on things. I arrived the day after he was killed." "And you waited all this time to approach me?" "I've been watching, trying to figure out if Hargrove was behind your father's death, trying to understand what I was dealing with before I got involved." "And have you? Figured it out, I mean?" Vaughn shook his head. "Not yet, but I'm getting closer." "Well, unless you can come up with a small fortune in the next 2 weeks, I'm afraid your investigation will be cut short. That's when I lose the ranch, unless I agree to marry Hargrove." "Don't do it," Vaughn said, his voice suddenly urgent. "Don't marry him, Rose." The use of her first name startled her. "What choice do I have? I can't lose my home. It's all I have left of my parents." "There are always choices," Vaughn insisted. "Give me those 2 weeks. Let me help you find another way." Rose studied him, trying to read the sincerity in his eyes. "Why would you do that for me? You don't even know me." "I owed your father my life," Vaughn said simply, "and I don't like seeing good people backed into corners by men like Hargrove." Rose considered his offer. It wasn't as if she had any better options. "All right," she agreed finally. 2 weeks. But I'm not getting my hopes up." The next day, Vaughn arrived at the Lawson ranch shortly after dawn, dressed for work in sturdy clothing. "First things first," he said. "We need to get this place running properly again. You can't handle it all alone." Over the next few days, they fell into a rhythm. Vaughn helped with the heavy labor mending fences, repairing the roof that had been leaking, breaking the wild Mustang Rose's father had captured before his death, but never had a chance to train. Rose, in turn, kept up with her usual chores, tending the small vegetable garden, caring for the chickens, and cooking their meals. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sunset over the mountains as Vaughn shared more stories about her father's younger days. Rose found herself laughing for the first time since her father's death, the weight of her grief and worry temporarily lifting. "He really tried to pay for supplies with a pet raccoon?" she asked incredulously one evening. Vaughn grinned. "Hand to God, Said the critter was worth its weight in gold for how it could fish. The storekeeper wasn't having any of it, though. Rose shook her head, smiling. It's strange to think of him being so young and carefree. By the time I was old enough to remember, he was always so serious. Losing your mother changed him, Vaughn observed. Loss has a way of doing that to a person. Rose nodded, her smile fading. I barely remember her. I was only 6 when she died of the fever. He raised you well, Vaughn said softly. You're strong, capable. She'd be proud. Rose felt a warmth spread through her at his words, followed immediately by confusion at her reaction. She shouldn't care what this virtual stranger thought of her, yet somehow his opinion had begun to matter. As days passed, Rose found herself watching Vaughn when he wasn't looking, the way the muscles in his back rippled as he chopped wood, the gentle way he handled the animals, the quiet competence with which he approached every task. There was something comforting about his presence, a steadiness that made her feel safe for the first time since her father's death. But as their 2-week deadline approached, Rose's anxiety returned. Despite all their hard work, they were no closer to raising the money needed to pay off the bank. Maybe I should just accept Hargrove's offer, Rose said one evening as they sat at the kitchen table, going over the ranch accounts for what felt like the 100th time. At least then I could keep the ranch. At what cost? Vaughn demanded, his voice sharper than she'd ever heard it. That man is dangerous, Rose. I've been asking around town. 3 of his former wives died under suspicious circumstances. 1 fell downstairs, 1 drowned in a shallow creek, and 1 supposedly shot herself while cleaning his gun. Rose paled. You think he killed them? I can't prove it, Vaughn admitted, but the pattern is suspicious, and now with your father. Do you have any evidence that he was involved in Papa's death? Vaughn hesitated. Nothing concrete, but I've been talking to people who saw your father in town that day. He argued with Hargrove at the general store. It got heated enough that several people noticed. Rose's heart raced. That's still not proof. No, but it's motive and opportunity. Hargrove knew which trail your father would take home. If that's true, then marrying him would be madness, Rose said. It would, Vaughn agreed, reaching across the table to take her hand. His touch sent an unexpected jolt through her. We'll find another way, Rose. I promise. The next morning, Rose awoke to the sound of horses approaching. She hurried to the door, her heart sinking when she recognized Elias Hargrove and 2 of his men riding toward the house. Vaughn emerged from the barn, positioning himself between Rose and the approaching riders. Well, well, Hargrove called out as he reined in his horse. What have we here? Miss Lawson, I'm surprised at you, entertaining a man alone at your home. What would your dear departed father say about such impropriety? Mr. Blackwell is a friend of my father's, Rose replied, stepping forward to stand beside Vaughn. He's been helping me with the ranch. How very neighborly of him. Hargrove's gaze shifted to Vaughn, his eyes narrowing with recognition. Blackwell, I thought I ran you out of Colorado years ago. You tried, Vaughn replied evenly. It didn't take. Rose looked between the 2 men, the tension crackling like lightning before a storm. You 2 know each other? Oh, we go way back, Hargrove said with a cold smile. Blackwell here used to work for me, until he developed an inconvenient conscience and tried to interfere in my business. You were rustling cattle and blaming it on the Ute, Vaughn countered. An innocent man was hanged because of you. Hargrove dismissed this with a wave of his hand. Ancient history. I'm here to speak with Miss Lawson about our arrangement. There is no arrangement, Rose said firmly. I haven't agreed to anything. No? Hargrove raised an eyebrow. Then perhaps you should speak with Mr. Peterson at the bank. He's prepared to foreclose on your property tomorrow unless the debt is paid in full. However, I've generously offered to assume that debt in exchange for your hand in marriage. She's not marrying you, Hargrove, Vaughn said, his hand drifting toward his gun. That's not for you to decide, Cowboy, Hargrove sneered, unless you've got $3,000 to give her. Vaughn's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. As I thought, Hargrove said smugly. Miss Lawson, I'll give you until tomorrow to make your decision. Either agree to become Mrs. Hargrove or watch your precious ranch be sold at auction." With that, he turned his horse and rode away, his men following close behind. Once they were out of earshot, Rose turned to Vaughn. "What did he mean about running you out of Colorado?" Vaughn sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's a long story, but the short version is that I worked as a foreman on Hargrove's ranch about 5 years ago. I discovered he was rustling cattle from neighboring ranches and framing the local Ute for it. A man was lynched based on Hargrove's lies. When I threatened to go to the law, Hargrove had his men beat me half to death and leave me for dead in the mountains. How did you survive?" "A Ute hunting party found me. They nursed me back to health." Vaughn's expression darkened. "By the time I recovered, Hargrove had spread word that I was the rustler. There was a bounty on my head. I had to leave the territory. But now you're back. I heard Hargrove was causing trouble for your father. I wanted to help, to finally bring him to justice, but I arrived too late." Rose processed this information, pieces falling into place. "That's why you've been helping me. Not just because of my father, but because of your history with Hargrove." "That's how it started," Vaughn admitted, "but it's not why I stayed." Their eyes met, and Rose felt a flutter in her chest at the intensity of his gaze. Before she could respond, a shout from the road drew their attention. It was Danny Sullivan, Mrs. Sullivan's grandson, riding hard toward the ranch. "Miss Lawson, Mr. Blackwell," the boy called as he neared. "Sheriff Peyton sent me to fetch you. He says he's got news about Mr. Lawson's murder." Rose and Vaughn exchanged a look of surprise before rushing to saddle their horses. The ride into Cripple Creek was tense, neither speaking as they pushed their mounts to a gallop. Sheriff Peyton was waiting for them at his office, a grim expression on his weathered face. "Miss Lawson, Mr. Blackwell, thank you for coming so quickly." "Danny said you have news about my father's murder," Rose said, barely containing her impatience. The sheriff nodded, gesturing for them to sit. "One of Hargrove's men, Joe Simmons, got drunk at the saloon last night. Started bragging about jobs he'd done for the boss that weren't exactly legal." Peyton's eyes met Rose's. "Including shooting your father." Rose felt as though all the air had been sucked from the room. "He confessed to killing my father on Hargrove's orders?" "Not in so many words," Peyton admitted. "He was careful not to say anything that direct, but he implied heavily that Hargrove wanted your father taken care of after their argument in town." "That's not enough to arrest Hargrove," Vaughn pointed out. "No, but it's enough to arrest Simmons," Peyton replied, "which I did this morning. He's sleeping it off in the cell now. Once he realizes the trouble he's in, he might be willing to testify against Hargrove in exchange for leniency. Or Hargrove might have him silenced before he can talk," Vaughn said darkly. Peyton frowned. "I've thought of that. I've deputized extra men to guard the jail. But we need to move quickly. Miss Lawson, I understand Hargrove has been pressuring you to marry him?" Rose nodded. "He's given me until tomorrow to decide. Otherwise, the bank will foreclose on the ranch." "We might be able to use that," Peyton mused, "if we could get Hargrove to incriminate himself somehow." "No," Vaughn said firmly. "It's too dangerous. I won't let Rose put herself in harm's way." "It's not your decision," Rose countered, a plan already forming in her mind. "If I agree to marry Hargrove, I could get him to confess. Wear a wire or something." "Absolutely not," Vaughn insisted. "The man's already killed at least 4 people that we know of. I won't risk your life on a scheme like this." "It may be our only chance to bring him to justice," Rose argued, "for my father and all his other victims." "There's got to be another way," Vaughn said, his voice tight with frustration. Sheriff Peyton held up a hand to quiet them both. "Let me see what I can get out of Simmons first. Maybe we won't need to resort to such desperate measures. In the meantime, Miss Lawson, it might be safer if you stayed in town tonight. Hargrove might get wind of Simmons's arrest and come looking for you." Rose reluctantly agreed, and arrangements were made for her to stay with Mrs. Sullivan. Vaughn insisted on escorting her there, his protective instincts in full force. "I don't like this," he muttered as they walked through town. "Hargrove's desperate now. There's no telling what he might do." "I'm not afraid of him," Rose said, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Vaughn stopped, turning to face her. You should be. The man's a monster, Rose, and I couldn't bear it if something happened to you. The raw emotion in his voice caught her off guard. Why do you care so much? Is it just because of your history with Hargrove, or because you feel you owe my father? It started that way, Vaughn admitted, his green eyes searching hers. But now it's about you, Rose. Over these past 2 weeks, I've come to care for you more than I thought possible. Rose's breath caught in her throat. Vaughn. I know it's too soon, he continued hastily. I know you're in an impossible situation, but I want you to know that whatever happens, I'm on your side. And if there was any way I could spare you from marrying Hargrove, I would. There might be, Rose said slowly, an idea taking shape. If we could prove he was behind my father's murder before tomorrow. That's a big if, Vaughn pointed out, and even if Simmons talks, it might not be enough evidence to arrest Hargrove immediately. Then we need a backup plan, Rose insisted, something to buy us more time. They reached Mrs. Sullivan's modest house, but before Rose could knock, Vaughn caught her arm. Wait, I just had a thought. What if we were to get married instead? Rose stared at him, stunned. What? Hear me out, Vaughn said, his words coming faster now. As your husband, I could legally assume responsibility for your debts. It would at least buy us time to build a case against Hargrove. You're suggesting we get married, just like that? It wouldn't have to be forever, Vaughn assured her. Once Hargrove is behind bars and the ranch is secure, we could get an annulment if that's what you wanted. Rose's mind raced. It was a practical solution to her immediate problem, but the thought of marrying a man she barely knew, even one she was growing increasingly attracted to, was overwhelming. I need time to think, she said finally. Vaughn nodded, releasing her arm. Of course, it's a lot to consider. But Rose, he added, his voice softening, whatever you decide, know that I meant what I said. I care for you, and I'll help you however I can. Rose watched him walk away, her emotions in turmoil. The practical part of her could see the sense in his suggestion it would solve her immediate financial problems and keep her safe from Hargrove. But another part of her, the part that had started to dream of a different kind of future with Vaughn, felt a pang of disappointment that his proposal had been so pragmatic. Mrs. Sullivan welcomed her warmly, fussing over her like the mother Rose barely remembered. After a simple supper, Rose retired to the small guest bedroom, but sleep eluded her as she weighed her options. By morning, she had made her decision. She would accept Vaughn's proposal not just as a practical solution, but because in the short time she'd known him, she'd begun to feel something she'd never experienced before. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a beginning. A seed that could grow into something beautiful if given the chance. She was just preparing to leave Mrs. Sullivan's house to find Vaughn when urgent knocking at the door startled them both. It was Danny, his young face flushed with excitement. Miss Lawson, they got him! Sheriff Peyton arrested Hargrove this morning. What? Rose gasped. How? Simmons talked, Danny explained breathlessly. Told everything. How Hargrove ordered him to kill your pa. How he's been rustling cattle for years. Everything. Sheriff's got deputies searching Hargrove's house now for more evidence. Relief flooded through Rose, so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees. Where's Vaughn? Is he with the sheriff? Danny nodded. He's at the jail. Asked me to fetch you there if you were willing. Rose was already reaching for her shawl. Mrs. Sullivan. Thank you for your hospitality, but I need to go. The older woman smiled knowingly. Go on, child, and give that handsome cowboy my best. The streets of Cripple Creek were buzzing with the news of Hargrove's arrest. As Rose made her way to the jail, townspeople stopped to offer their congratulations and support. She found Vaughn outside the sheriff's office, deep in conversation with Peyton. His face lit up when he spotted her approaching, and he quickly excused himself to meet her. Is it true? Rose asked, scarcely daring to hope. They've arrested Hargrove for my father's murder? Vaughn nodded, a smile breaking across his face. Simmons gave us everything we needed. Apparently, Hargrove had been planning this for months. When your father refused to pressure you into the marriage, Hargrove decided to eliminate him, figuring you'd be easier to manipulate alone. He was wrong about that, Rose said firmly. He certainly was, Vaughn agreed, his eyes warm with admiration. Hargrove's being held without bail. The judge is already on his way from Denver to preside over the case. With Simmons's testimony and the evidence they found at Hargrove's ranch, including your father's pocket watch, there's no way he's escaping justice this time. Rose felt tears of relief welling in her eyes. I can hardly believe it's over. Not quite over, Vaughn corrected gently. There's still the matter of the bank loan. Oh, Rose's elation dimmed somewhat. I'd almost forgotten about that in all the excitement. I spoke with Peterson this morning, Vaughn continued, explained the situation. He's agreed to give you an extension, considering the circumstances. That's wonderful news, Rose said, though she couldn't help wondering what would happen when the extension ran out. The ranch's financial problems hadn't magically disappeared with Hargrove's arrest. Vaughn seemed to read her thoughts. Rose, about what I suggested yesterday. Your marriage proposal? She asked, a small smile playing at her lips. It wasn't much of a proposal, he admitted ruefully. More of a business arrangement. But the truth is, I was just looking for any excuse to keep you from marrying Hargrove. And now that he's no longer a threat? Vaughn took a deep breath, taking her hands in his. Now I'd like to court you properly, get to know you better. And maybe someday when you're ready, I'll ask that question again, not as a solution to a problem, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Rose felt a warmth spreading through her chest at his words. I think I'd like that, Vaughn Blackwell. He smiled, relief evident in his expression. Good, because I'm not planning on leaving Cripple Creek anytime soon. What about your life before? You've been wandering for years from what you've told me. Maybe I was just looking for a reason to stop wandering, he said softly. Maybe I've found it. The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. With Hargrove awaiting trial in Denver, his vast holdings were frozen. Evidence continued to mount against him, not just for Thomas Lawson's murder, but for a pattern of crimes stretching back years. True to his word, Vaughn stayed in Cripple Creek, helping Rose bring the Lawson ranch back to prosperity. He moved into the bunkhouse, respecting propriety while still being close enough to assist with the daily work. Their courtship progressed naturally, stolen moments of conversation on the porch after dinner, Sunday rides to explore the beautiful country around Cripple Creek, occasional meals at the hotel restaurant in town. With each passing day, Rose's feelings for Vaughn deepened, transforming from gratitude and attraction into something far more profound. In late October, with the aspens blazing gold against the mountainsides, Elias Hargrove was found guilty of murder and sentenced to hang. Rose attended the trial in Denver, Vaughn steadfastly by her side as she testified about her father's final days and Hargrove's persistent unwanted advances. After the verdict was read, Rose felt as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Justice had been served, and her father could rest in peace. What do you want to do now? Vaughn asked as they left the courthouse. We could stay in Denver for a few days, see the sights. Rose shook her head. I want to go home, our home. Vaughn's eyes widened slightly at her choice of words. Our home? If you want it to be, Rose said softly. Rose Lawson, are you proposing to me? He asked, a grin spreading across his face. She laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. Maybe I am, unless you'd rather do the asking. In answer, Vaughn pulled her into a quiet corner of the courthouse steps, dropped to one knee, and took her hand in his. Rose Lawson, these past months have been the happiest of my life. I love you more than I ever thought possible. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Yes, Rose whispered, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks. Yes, I will. They were married on Christmas Eve in the small church in Cripple Creek, with Mrs. Sullivan beaming from the front pew and Sheriff Peyton serving as Vaughn's best man. The entire town turned out to celebrate, the community that had rallied around Rose in her darkest hour, now sharing in her joy. That night, as snow fell gently outside the windows of the ranch house, their house now, Vaughn took Rose in his arms, his touch gentle yet passionate. "I never thought I could be this happy," Rose confessed as they lay together in the darkness. "After my father died, I thought my life was over, that I would have to marry a man I hated just to survive." Vaughn brushed a strand of hair from her face, his expression serious. "I promised myself the day I met you that I would show you what real love feels like, that you would never have to settle for less than you deserve." "And you have," Rose whispered, pressing her lips to his. "Every day, in 1,000 different ways, you show me what love truly is." As winter gave way to spring, Rose and Vaughn worked side by side to make the ranch thrive. With his experience and her determination, they expanded their herd, repaired the long-neglected buildings, and even hired 2 reliable hands to help with the increasing workload. In late April, as wildflowers began to carpet the meadows around the ranch, Rose shared the news she'd been suspecting for weeks. They were going to have a baby. Vaughn's reaction was everything she could have hoped for. His joy infectious as he swept her into his arms, twirling her around the kitchen before setting her down with exaggerated care, suddenly worried he might have been too rough. "I'm not made of glass," Rose laughed, pressing his hand to her still flat stomach. "We're both fine." "A family," Vaughn said wonderingly. "Our family." "It's more than I ever dared to dream," Rose admitted. "Sometimes I'm afraid I'll wake up and find it was all just that, a dream." Vaughn pulled her close, his arms strong and secure around her. "This is real, Rose. What we've built together is real. And it's only the beginning." Their son, Thomas Vaughn Blackwell, was born on a crisp November day in 1878, almost exactly a year and a half after Thomas Lawson's death. He had his father's green eyes and his mother's determined spirit, evident from his first lusty cries. As Rose held their child, with Vaughn perched on the edge of the bed beside them, she felt a sense of completion she'd never known before. "He's perfect," Vaughn murmured, gently stroking the baby's downy head. "He is," Rose agreed, "and he'll grow up knowing how much he's loved, how much we all are." The years that followed brought more children, twin daughters Emma and Elizabeth, born in 1880, and another son, Michael, who arrived in 1883. The Blackwell Ranch prospered, eventually expanding to include the adjacent properties as neighbors sold out and moved on. Through it all, Rose and Vaughn's love only deepened, tempered by the inevitable challenges of life but never diminished. They weathered droughts and blizzards, economic downturns and personal losses, always emerging stronger together than they had been apart. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1902, with their children grown and starting families of their own, Vaughn surprised Rose with a trip to San Francisco, a city she had always dreamed of visiting. "How did you manage all this?" she asked as they stood on the deck of a ferry crossing the bay, the wind whipping her hair around her face despite her efforts to contain it beneath her hat. Vaughn smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening with his happiness. "I've been planning it for years, putting a little aside each month." Rose shook her head in wonder. 25 years together, and you still find ways to surprise me." "I intend to keep surprising you for at least 25 more," he promised, pulling her close against the chill of the bay. "Do you ever regret it?" Rose asked suddenly. "Settling down with me, giving up your wandering ways?" Vaughn looked at her as if she'd asked if he regretted breathing. "Not for a single moment. The day I met you was the luckiest day of my life, Rose Blackwell. You saved me as surely as I helped you." "How did I save you?" "By giving me a home, a purpose, a reason to become the best version of myself." He kissed her tenderly, heedless of the other passengers around them. "By showing me what love really means." As they returned to Cripple Creek and resumed their life together, Rose often reflected on how close she had come to a very different fate. Had her father not befriended Vaughn years before, had Vaughn not arrived when he did, Had they not found the courage to stand against Hargrove together, any one of these things could have altered the course of her life irrevocably. Instead, she had found a love that sustained her through decades, that blessed her with children and grandchildren, that transformed a struggling ranch into a thriving legacy they would someday pass on to the next generation. When Vaughn passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1927, at the age of 86, Rose was beside him, as she had been for 50 years. Though her grief was profound, it was tempered by gratitude for the lifetime they had shared and the knowledge that he had lived exactly as he'd wanted on his own terms, surrounded by love. Rose herself lived another 5 years, long enough to see her great-grandchildren begin to arrive and to share with them stories of the brave cowboy who had shown a frightened young woman what true love felt like, rescuing her from a fate worse than death and building with her a life more beautiful than either of them could have imagined. And in Cripple Creek, long after both Rose and Vaughn were gone, their story was still told of how love had triumphed over greed and violence, of how a single act of courage had changed not just 2 lives, but generations to follow. It became a legend of the West, a testament to the power of love to transform even the darkest circumstances into something worthy and lasting. For Rose and Vaughn had discovered what truly mattered in life, not wealth or power or even justice, though all had their place, but the quiet miracle of 2 hearts finding their way to each other against all odds, and in that finding, creating something that would endure long after they were gone.